Hi friends! Today I actually wanted to make a video on this one specific question that I get asked a lot by my students, and so I thought, why not just make a video, because I'm sure if my students are asking me this question, then there are obviously more people out there who pretty much have the same question. So in today's video we are going to learn how to read the Pmbok guide, and the edition we are going to refer to is the 6th edition of the book. Now, I get this from the students all the time, especially the ones that are kind of, seeing the book for the first time and they're trying to understand how to go about reading this Pmbok guide. And if you look at the book, you'll see that there are a couple parts to it. There's a part 1, there's a part 2, there's a part 3 to the book. And students ask me, which one do I focus on? Because if you look at part 1 and part 2, they are very closely aligned with each other. It's almost as if the same stuff is being repeated in part 1 and part 2. So students are like, which is that part that I need to focus on? So today we are going to talk about what this book is, how it's structured, and how do we go about reading it as a student. What do you need to focus on from the Pmbok guide? So there are two parts, the two important parts to this book, all right? Now the part 2 is the standard for project management, all right? And so if you open the book, you'll see that there is a section called part 2 in the book. So it's called the standard for project management. Now this is basically the standard that was developed by the American National Standards Institute, all right? And the first part of the Pmbok guide is actually based on this very standard. All right, think about it like this. The first part is what PMI is telling us about, project management and the techniques for project management. But whatever they have put in part 1 is actually based on that standard, which is in the part 2 of the book, and that was developed by the American National Standards Institute. So for that reason, you will see that, part 1 and part 2 kind of look almost the same, right? If you just go through the index and you go through the different topics that are covered in each part, you'll see that, they pretty much sound the same. And that's where students get confused a lot, all right? So the part 1 of this book, of the Pmbok guide, is basically what has been proposed by PMI. All right, PMI doesn't make changes to the ANSI standard. PMI only makes revisions to what they have to say about the ANSI standard, or how they talk about the techniques and project management skills based on the ANSI standard. So the part 1 of the book is the actual Pmbok guide authored by Project Management Institute. So it consists of all of these 10 knowledge areas, the 5 process groups, right? Initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, closing, and then the 49 processes. So we have like about 49 in the 6th edition. We had 47 in the past, and PMI makes those revisions every 5 years or so. So you're going to see new editions of this Pmbok guide every couple years. So PMI, once again, took that ANSI standard, elaborated it, and tried to explain it in more effective terms and language. All right. Both these standards, the one that is proposed by PMI and the ANSI standard, of which the PMI is basically based off on, are descriptive practices. Okay. And that actually brings me to another very important point about this Pmbok guide, the project management body of knowledge, that the Pmbok guide, and I don't know why, but a lot of experienced project managers, even the PMP certified project managers, have this misunderstanding that Pmbok is a methodology, that it is a project methodology. I've seen, I've talked to customers, I've talked to project managers, and when they talk about some of their projects, so they're like, oh, we are using the Pmbok methodology. There is no such methodology out there. Pmbok is not a methodology. It is only a book of good practices, good project management practices as proposed by PMI. All right. And PMI hasn't really, just come up with all of these processes and practices on their own, but it is actually based off of feedback that they receive from the global project management community. All right. So please remember that Pmbok is not a methodology, but it is a book of good practices or better practices. Now, the third part to this book is the glossary. And I wanted to talk about this one because I think it is so important for students to go through the glossary, to read it, understand how, our everyday words, how they kind of mean a little different when it comes to our PMP and the PMI and the Pmbok guide. Okay, so there is a little bit of a difference in how these words are used in our project management language by PMI. Okay, so there is a lingo element to the Pmbok guide. That's what I mean, and that is going to be reflected on the exam. So you're going to see the same language, the same set of words being used. So it's really, really important for us to understand, what is that language Pmbok uses. All right, what do all these different words mean in PMI's world, because that's what your exam is going to be about. So, for students, I highly recommend this to all of my students, that, if you, and this is the thing, you don't have to read the Pmbok guide for the PMP exam. It's just a book that has been proposed by PMI, and it is a very valuable book. So don't get me wrong here. And it is a book that the exam is going to be based off on to a large extent, but it is not the only book. So PMI is actually not telling you that you have to read this Pmbok guide to pass the PMP exam. You could refer to so many other books out there in the market. But for the exam, understanding the language that is used by PMI, understanding how questions are phrased, that is very important, and that understanding will only come if you go through the book. So even if you don't plan to go through the entire book, which I totally understand, because the Pmbok, even as of today, it is a bit of a difficult read. So it's not easy to read, and people get very bored very easily with the Pmbok guide. But for the exam, just to understand the lingo element, I highly suggest that you go through the book for the exam, to understand the language and how it is used on the PMP exams. So the glossary will help you in that context. Now the guide has, the 6th edition of the book has also made an introduction to Agile concepts. All right, so this is something new to Pmbok, new to the PMP exam. And in fact, what PMI did is, with the 6th edition of the Pmbok guide, they gave an extra book called the Agile Practice Guide. Okay, so it comes with your 6th edition, and it is a very, very good book. I love that book, and I tell this to all of my students again, that if you are, especially if you're someone who's new to Agile environments, and you just aren't used to doing Agile projects, then it is highly recommended that you go through the Agile Practice Guide, because unlike the Pmbok guide, this book is very simple and easy to understand. So maybe I'll try to do another video on the Agile Practice Guide sometime, to just help you understand what this book is like. But they have done a very good job with the Agile Practice Guide, and so I will recommend that you do give it a read. It's a very simple book, easy to understand, very simple language used in there. It really explains the concepts that we usually have in a traditional PMP course, and concepts that relate to sequential project management in an Agile environment, how to implement all of these processes in an Agile environment. The 49 processes, how do we implement those when we are running an Agile project, which has a lot of changes. It's more dynamic in nature. PMI has introduced these Agile concepts in the 6th edition, with the 6th edition, and so you are going to see Agile questions on the PMP exam. There is one very important distinction between our traditional projects and our Agile projects, that is in the use of the change control process, as PMI calls it, as the perform integrated change control. Now, with the traditional projects, we typically have a very robust and a very detailed and thorough change control process, right? Every time there is a change request, every time your stakeholder comes up with an enhancement request, you need to go through the change control process as a project manager, and PMI places a lot of importance on that. There used to be a significant, on an average, it used to be something like 30-40 questions just on the change control process in the past for the PMP exam. But that has diluted a bit because of the introduction of Agile concepts, because with our Agile projects, we did not have a change control process. So there is no PICC process, the perform integrated change control process, that we use with our Agile projects, because Agile projects are, structured in such a way that they are, open to changes, and there are changes happening pretty frequently in our Agile projects. So because of that, you're going to see a lesser amount of change control questions because PMI is now trying to accommodate all of these agile questions, on the PMP exam. But it is important to know the PICC process because it will still be a significant number of questions. But at the same time, it is also very important that you understand your agile concepts. Now, I wouldn't recommend for someone who is going for the PMP exam to get into the nitty-gritty stuff of agile project management. So you don't have to worry too much about the values, the agile principles, those kind of things, but just understand how agile projects are structured, what that environment is like, what is that role a project manager plays in an agile project, right? So the role differs a little bit. Okay, so the set of responsibilities differ a little bit. The teams are different. If we compare it to our traditional projects, the teams and the type of work they do and the role they get to play in our agile projects is different. They are more robust, they are more of a self-organizing team, and so the project manager is actually kind of stepping away from a little bit of the responsibilities that a typical project manager in the traditional and the sequential projects kind of handles. So there is that difference, and for that reason, I would suggest that you do go through the Agile Practice Guide and understand how Agile environments differ from our traditional project environments and how the rules changes as well. And then trying to get familiar with certain terms that are used in Agile projects, such as iterations and sprints and user stories. Those things are also going to be very, very important for the PMP exam. All right, so Agile is in, and I'm sure that as we kind of, move forward, and as PMI releases new editions of the Pmbok guide, there's going to be more and more stuff about the Agile project management, and as well as there'll be introduction to hybrid project management, the hybrid methodologies, which is sort of like the latest and greatest in project management. So other parts to this Pmbok guide. So Pmbok has introduced another topic called tailoring. All right, and now tailoring is a topic that is very important. In my opinion, it is a very significant topic that kind of brings our classroom knowledge to practical world application, right? So it is one where we are kind of discussing based on the processes as described in the Pmbok guide for each of these 10 knowledge areas. How do we implement them in our projects? How do we implement them in projects based on whether we have a agile project management cycle here? Are we using an agile methodology or a waterfall methodology, a sequential methodology, a hybrid methodology? How do we tailor these processes that we have in the book, the 49 processes that are done over the life of the project? How do we tailor them? How do we change them? How do we do them in a project's life? How many iterations of the processes are we going to do? How many sequences are we going to build? How often do we need to run certain sequences? So how is that decided? How do you make those decisions as a project manager? So that is what the tailoring concept is about. So that's a very important discussion, and that's part of the Pmbok guide. So I would highly suggest, again, please go through that part as well. It will really help you understand, build a greater understanding of how these processes will work in our real life projects. Because understand this, that the Pmbok talks about 49 processes, or maybe 47 before, or maybe they'll have more in the future, whatever that is. The Pmbok is not recommending that you do all of these processes, or you must do all of these processes in your projects as a PMP certified project manager. No, absolutely not. And you're not going to. That's not practical. You're only going to do the processes that are relevant to your project, based on the requirements of your project, based on the requirements and preferences of the organization you're running this project for. So tailoring is a very, very valid topic here, and Pmbok is now talking about it because this is what they heard from the global community, that all of these processes are just great, they don't apply all the time. So tailoring is very relevant. Tailoring must be done by a project manager for each project based on its unique requirements and of course the preferences from the organization as well. So Pmbok used to be a little bit rigid with its processes in the past, how they were like, you have to do this, you have to do this process. The There was the triple constraint concept that was used in the past. That has changed a bit now. In the past, what Pmbok used to say was that, a project, in order to be successful, in order to be called as a successful project, would need to land on all three sides of this triangle, where, it has to meet that scope requirement, it has to meet the budget requirement, as well as, the time requirement. So a project needs to be completed within the set time frame. It needs to be completed within the set budget without spending any additional money, and also complete the entire scope that was developed for the project, right? So nothing outside of the scope and nothing less than the scope designed. PMI kind of shifted away from that. In the 6th edition, you will see that they have kind of shifted away from that, where now they are really talking about how projects are now determined to be a success or failure based on the stakeholders' opinion. So the stakeholders have come into the picture. Now we understand that stakeholders are really, really, really important for projects, and they are the ones who decide whether a project is a success or a failure based on, how important the project is to them, how they are able to use the product, and how well it fits with the organization's strategic goals, and how it helps the organization achieve those strategic goals. So that triple constraint concept of scope, cost, and schedule is not as much relevant nowadays. So please remember that as well for the exams. So that has changed. So you're going to see these kind of changes, because the nice thing about the book is that it responds to the feedback from the community. So it's not just, the project managers here in the United States or Canada, but it is the global project management community. So PMI reaches out to the global community and then asks them, what's happening in your industry? How are you running projects now? What has changed? How are you implementing the stuff we proposed in the book? Maybe using it in a different way. So they're learning from the community, and then they are updating the books to make it more relevant. So in the 6th edition, a very detailed chapter on the role of the project manager is added. So in the past, it was just, maybe a paragraph or two. But now, there's a whole chapter dedicated to the role of a project manager. So in my opinion, I think this was long overdue. Because think about it, the PMP is a certification for the project managers, right? And the Pmbok is what we are referring to study for the PMP. And yet the Pmbok kind of missed on that, where, they weren't talking about the project manager's role in detail, when everything actually applies to them, and they being able to use these practices and techniques to run and manage projects. So I think that was a smart move on PMI's part, that they added this whole new chapter where they are explaining in much, much more detail about, what are the different characteristics of a project manager, how do project managers handle different situations, how they need to exhibit different leadership styles. Not one specific style kind of, best fits a project manager, but based on the situation at hand, based on the team that you're dealing with, you're going to have to exhibit different leadership styles. So they've kind of, expanded on all of that. So that's a very useful and important chapter for us to go through. The other thing that you just want to remember about this book is, like I said, it's a very highly recommended book for the PMP exam, but it is not the only book that you can actually refer to. In fact, a lot of students, they don't go through just the Pmbok guide, they go through a lot of other books out there. There are some topics that are actually excluded from the Pmbok guide but are still part of the PMP exam. All right, so these are popular topics because they tend to be popular questions on the PMP exam. So this is again based on the feedback from all these students and project managers who went for the PMP exam, who gave that exam. From that, we know that there are some topics that are actually outside of the Pmbok guide, but are very important for the PMP exam. The last thing that I want to talk about here with the book is that the relationship aspect of the processes, so the interconnection of the processes, even though it has been explained in some detail in the book, but it still remains a very challenging part for many students, because it's hard to document and explain these relationships. And for that reason, not only the Pmbok guide, but if you look at other books out there in the market, other authors, they also have not been able to explain this relationship concept. But that is very important for the PMP exam, understanding how the processes connect together, how they are done over the project's life. what are all these processes we're doing in sequences? What are all these processes that are going to be done in sequences and iterations? What are some of the processes that are happening simultaneously while we are doing all this other stuff in the project, so during the project's life? So that understanding, building that understanding is very important to passing that PMP exam. And that's where the experienced project managers, the more experienced ones, even struggle, and that's why they fail at that exam. Because more than half of the exam is going to be your situational questions, scenario-based questions, where this understanding and application of this understanding of the relationship of the processes will determine how you answer those questions. Please make an effort to understand the relationship, the interconnection of the processes, because it's all about the processes for us. So I've developed a course just to target this very important topic, the interconnection of the processes. Came up with my own custom chart, decompose these processes. I have like about 108 processes in my chart, and I took it a step further and I determined and showed how these processes are connected over the project's life and how they are done over a project's life. So I found that chart to be very useful. Students who have tried that chart have found it to be very, very useful. So I would highly recommend all of you who are going for the PMP or the CAPM, because as you know, it's still the Pmbok guide you're referring to for the CAPM exam. Please take my course, try it out, and understand the relationship concept. So that is it for today, you guys. I hope you found this useful. You've learned something new here. Now you know how to read the Pmbok guide. And the next time one of my students asks me, how do I read the book? I'm going to share the link to this video here, and I would encourage all of you to do the same. Share this and pass it around so that everyone who's trying for the PMP exam knows how to navigate the Pmbok guide. Thank you, everyone.